When you first start making beats, you might feel the need to buy new plugins because the ones that come stock don't sound all that great to you. Before you do though, I want to show you guys something really important that might have you rethink this entire idea. So you guys heard the beat in the intro. What I want to do now is play you guys another beat here. Now this beat sounds pretty awful. You guys can see I use mostly the stock plugins that come with FL Studio here. But what's interesting is this beat and the one in the intro are actually the exact same beat. The only difference is I turned off all of the effects here. So if I were to turn them all back on, and this is what I want to talk about today, just how powerful your mixing tools can be in your beat making process. For me, if you took away all of my plugins and I had to start over from scratch, the first things that I would rebuy would be my mixing plugins. When I first started making beats, I thought things like EQs and saturators were things that you'd use just to make your beat sound a little bit better. You'd use an EQ to slightly cut some frequencies, you'd use a saturator to slightly make things a little bit more warm, you'd use a filter and a subtle way to remove sounds, and you'd get an overall slightly more clean beat. But when I started using them in a different way, my entire beat making process drastically changed. So what I want to do is walk you guys through these sounds one by one and show you some of the things that I did here. You can see many of the sounds in this beat are from 3X Oscillator, which is probably the most basic FL Studio synth there is. First up, let's take a look at this sound here. This is how this sounds without any effects on it. Not entirely interesting, nor does it take up much room in the beat, so that's exactly what I wanted to do with this sound, make it a little bit bigger and a little bit more interesting. The first thing that I did here was I added some reverb to the sound just so it takes up more space in the beat. Next up, I have a couple of different saturators stacked on top of each other. You guys will hear it makes a pretty big difference. Now there's a lot more color in the high end, and it also adds a nice little layer of noise to the sound. Next up, to have it take up a little bit more room in the beat, I added some delay. This just helped the sound feel a little bit more wider in the mix. Then to control some of the extreme high end, just because it was a little bit too overbearing, I used an EQ as well as a filter. Then I used a pretty extreme saturator / distortion effect here. Next up, I added a little bit of gross beat here. You guys can see I have it set to a pretty low level. Preset that I use for gross beat, it plays the exact same sound but at an octave lower, just to take up more room in the frequency spectrum and have this sound be a little bit bigger. A little bit of crystallizer just for some extra effects, as well as another EQ at the very end. Again, just to control some of the frequencies that I don't need in this sound. So after all of that, the sound goes from sounding like this to sounding like this. I should explain though right off the bat, even though I can go in and explain how I used every single one of these effects after the fact, when it comes to using these types of tools, I can be just as creative as I would be if I'm trying to program an instrument, for example. It can be a game of experimentation where you're trying out different ideas, trying to figure out what sounds good and what doesn't. It doesn't have to be a straightforward scientific type of process. But even if you don't have third-party mixing tools like I have here, using stock effects can also yield some pretty good results as well. For example, let's say we go in and take a listen to this sound here. Again, this uses 3X Oscillator, and this is how it sounds without any effects on it. Now once I go ahead and turn on all the effects, This is a pretty big difference, and all I did was use stock plugins that come with FL Studio. Starting off, what I did was I used the effector plugin that comes with FL Studio, and I stacked 4 different instances on top of each other. For the first instance here, I used the Vox effect, which I believe is a formant shifting effect. Next up after that, I added some delay. And after that, I used another instance of effector, and I used the filter setting. And with the last instance of effector, I use some pretty aggressive distortion here. So if I turn it on, you'll notice I use a lot of saturation and distortion in my beats just because it has such a huge effect on our sounds. And we can end up with a drastically different sound if you use some pretty extreme settings in our distortion or saturation. After this, I used an EQ as well as a filter just to reel in the sound a little bit. So if I turn these on, then I added a flanger just to really change the way this sound sits in the mix and have it feel a little bit more wider. Then again, I added another instance of EQ just to help control this sound. Now that's a little bit more different after we added this flanger. And then at the end, I added a delay just to give it a little bit more of a spacey feel, just because I thought it sounded cool in the beat. So again, if I turn off all of these effects and turning them on, so you can see you can get some pretty impressive results by just using your stock effects as well. And this type of technique of using your mixing tools to get some pretty drastic results and having your sounds be a lot more interesting and unique doesn't just apply to synths. We can use this exact same type of idea with our drums as well. Notice that most of the drums that are in this beat come from the FPC. Not only that, what I did was I used the stock bank that comes with FPC, which doesn't sound all that great. These aren't sounds that you typically find in a hip-hop beat. Just as a disclaimer, by the way, just for full transparency, every single sound in this beat did use stock sounds, except for the kicks and the 808s. Anyways, this is how my drum loop sounds without any effects. Now, when I use these exact same types of techniques and ideas, my drums feel completely different at this point. So what I'll do is focus in on my snares to show you guys what I did here. Again, this is how the snare sounds without any effects. The first thing I did was I added some tape saturation to the sound. This removed a lot of the high ends and reduced some of that polish to the snare so it doesn't sound as clean. And then I used Camel Crusher, which is one of my favorite plugins. I plan on doing an entire video on this alone just because it's so powerful. Then once again, some more distortion just to shift the frequency of the sound a little bit. Then I added some EQ just to introduce a little bit more of the high end back into the sound, just so it cuts through the mix a tiny bit more. And to help add a little bit more into that high end, what I did was I added some bit crushing here. You guys can hear this makes a huge difference. It just helped me color that snare right in that perfect frequency area just to have it stand out in the mix a little bit more. And the wild thing is about the snare, it sounds a lot more loud and dense now. And yet looking at the output meter, this new snare actually takes up less room in the beat. You can see where this is peaking here. And if I turn on the effects, it's not peaking nearly as high. So you can see you can use these tools not only to make our sounds a little bit more interesting and unique, but also more functional as well. I remember when I first started making beats, I would read mixing advice on how to use these types of tools. How you should never make drastic cuts to your sound when you're using an EQ, or how you should never over compress any of your sounds. And I'd end up just getting confused because I would add an EQ on top of a sound, for example, and I'd do some drastic crazy boost that I didn't think I should have. And my sound would be drastically different from where I started, but it actually sounded good to me. But I'd feel like I was doing something wrong according to the traditional advice that I'd read online. Like for example, this sound here. I took this sound and I did some pretty drastic EQing here. I drastically cut a lot of the frequencies out, and I have a pretty dramatic boost right up here. This is how it would sound without using the EQ. And afterwards, It makes a pretty big difference. And it was only until I sat down with a mixing engineer who had been doing this for decades that I really understood what was happening here. What I didn't understand is there's multiple approaches when you're using these types of tools. And I broke it down into 2 different styles to use these types of mixing tools if you're a beat maker. We have functional mixing as well as creative mixing. Functional mixing is where you'll find those traditional types of ideas, how you shouldn't be too drastic with your boost for your EQ, how you should be subtle with your mixing tools. This type of approach to me is a sort of after the fact type of approach, where you take your beat which is already complete and what you want to do is make some subtle improvements just so it sounds a little bit more cleaner and the sound quality is improved. But there's also the idea of creative mixing where you take all of those ideas and you just throw them out the window. And what you do is you use these tools in a less subtle way. What you're trying to do is be a lot more extreme with your intention with how you use these tools, just so you can take your sound from its initial starting point and you end up with a pretty drastically different result at the very end. And for me, the idea of creative mixing, this is something that I do during the beat making process instead of waiting until after the fact to do all of these types of things. And so there you go. If you guys have been feeling like you're limited just because you have stock plugins, I'm hoping this video has shown you guys some of the possibilities that you might not have known about. If you guys have found this video helpful, please do like and subscribe. As always, my free drum kit is available in the description box below. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what some of your favorite mixing tools are, and I will see you guys next Tuesday.